and I like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this webinar. So this is one that I've been wanting to give for quite a while now. The official title is Common Budget Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. So I am the Assistant Budget Director, at least one of two, for the Department of Local Government Finance. And I started with the DLGF back in 2011, just a couple months before Gateway officially launched. It was really supporting those new users, those new local officials on using Gateway for the very, very first time. And it was interesting. So we have learned a lot over the past 12 years. And I've seen a lot of mistakes, a lot not mistakes, but definitely a lot of mistakes that I want to give you the opportunity to learn from other people's misfortunes, unfortunately, from this experience and help you avoid them. So the one thing about budgeting is there's absolutely no room for excitement. We don't want plot twists. We want budgeting to be predictable without any surprises. We want it to be relatively boring. That's good in budgeting. So today, we'll review some helpful tips on how to accomplish this.
Brian, I think you muted yourself.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, so one of the first things that we'll touch on is not stay in touch with your number one resource. Now, we'll talk about this one in the next slide, but it's a really important one. Then we'll delve into the common mistakes by each and every budget form. We'll talk about some special circumstances that apply to some units, but not all. And then we'll talk about what to do if the unexpected does actually happen. So we're going to prevent, and then just in case it does happen, we'll talk about what to do. So let's start with your number one resource. That is your DLGF budget field wrap. On the far right, we've got this budget field wrap map where you can see the budget field wrap for each and every county. Now, for some odd reason, you have not been in touch with your budget field wrap this year yet. I am going to assign you homework. Make sure that you look up who your budget field rep is, write down their name, their number, and their email address, and reach out to them. Because at this point in time, you and your budget field rep should have probably spoken at least once, probably more than once already. So they are absolutely your number one resource. But with that being said, there is one superpower that we actually don't have. It's the ability to give financial and legal advice. So we leave that to the financial advisors and the lawyers. Now, most local officials go through the budgeting process once a year, but DLGF budget field reps are in a very unique position where we go through the process about 200 times each and every year. And while most of us don't know the intricacies of how to run a unit of government, we get to devote all of our time. We get to become specialists in the very narrow scope that is budgeting. So we get to become experts in that field, and we're happy to share what we've learned along the way to help make the budgeting process run nice and smoothly. So let's talk about some things that we can help you with. So if you feel like you've got a good handle on the forms and just want us to look them over, check for some common mistakes, we're absolutely happy to. We can also check your dates on your advertisement, your Form 3, to make sure that those are timely, because unfortunately, if they're not just right, that's where you may have an adoption or an advertising that's not right. And what happens there is the budget and property taxes get continued from the prior year. So that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to protect against. And then you have a budget form menu where you select between all the different forms. On the top left, there's something called the Error Prevention Report. And that's something that's very, very helpful to run before you submit your Form 3, which is your notice to taxpayers, your advertisement. And you also want to run it again before you get your Form 4 ready. Now, Form 4 is the adoption resolution or ordinance. That is really a template you print off and have it signed at the adoption meeting. Now, while those errors are very helpful, I could absolutely see there being some newer local officials, or maybe some more experienced ones, that get some errors there sometimes that they don't quite know what they mean. If that ever happens, no worries. Pick up the phone, type an email, and reach out to your budget field rep. That's what we're here to help for. And we appreciate the job security. It's kind of cliche now, but we have, I still hear, oh, but I didn't want to ask a dumb question. The only dumb questions are the ones that aren't asked. I'd much rather somebody ask than assume incorrectly. That's what terrifies me. That's what keeps me up at night. So definitely feel free to ask. If for some reason we don't know the answer, we'll either find it for you or help do our best to point you in the right direction. We can also help you with finding some historical figures. So what did you do last year? There is a wealth of information out there. So we can help kind of be your guide to finding those resource materials that are most helpful to you. Now, while we can't give you financial advice, we can equip you with the understanding that's needed for you and your township board or your council to make your own informed financial decisions. So we can't tell you what's best, but we can help kind of point out what information is needed for you to help make those decisions yourself. Now we're gonna move on to the next section where we look at the common mistakes by each budget form. One of the biggest common mistakes that we see is people working through the forms, going through the motions without actually understanding what the forms are or how they work together. So the budgeting process spans 18 months. This is the last 6 months of the current year, the year that we're in now, and then all 12 months of the budget year next year. And the current year financial worksheet, oddly enough, focuses on the current year. That makes sense. And it's essentially a snapshot of where we're at as of June 30th. Now you can see there's different blue headers here. Line 5, line 6, 7, 16, 1, and 2. Not really in order, but these are the different lines that this is calculating for Form 4B. So we're going to take a little bit of time here to just kind of quickly run through each line here on the current year financial worksheet and how that ties into Form 4B. Then we'll delve into these in more detail later on. So the fifth line of Form 4B is the biggest calculation we have on here. We have our current year approved budget. This is the original certified value by the DLGF, your permission to spend for this current year. From there, if you had an expenditure from the prior year that the board or council formally carried over to be paid in the current year, so that was a carryover or an encumbrance, as they like to call them, that would be entered here. That would increase your permission to spend. It's also possible that you did something called an additional appropriation. You're seeking to spend more than you originally had permission to spend from the DLGF budget order. That would go in line 3A, or maybe the opposite happened. The board or council decided to formally reduce how much you can spend in the current year through a resolution ordinance. That'd be on line 3B, and that would reduce your permission to spend. Now, this is if this was done and approved by June 30th. And if it's an additional appropriations based off when it was actually submitted and approved by the DLGF. Now this takes us down to line 4, other non-appropriated obligations. To summarize it up quickly, that is spending that does not need to be budgeted, but we'll delve into that with 2 slides shortly. So line 5 is the total permission you have to spend for the entire year. And on line 6, we subtract out how much you have spent for the first 6 months. So with that, we get line 7, your remaining permission to spend for July 1st through December 31st. Now, one thing here is sometimes boards, councils decide to reduce the budget in the last 6 months. We typically see that more in the last 6 months than the first 6 months. And this is where you can include that reduction. Now, at this point in time, it can be anticipated, but by the time the DLGF reviews the budget, we need the actual resolution or ordinance to do that. You subtract it out, that is your estimated ending your ending appropriation, your ending permission spend for July through December. Now, if you decide that that's not enough, and the board of council passes, it goes through the motions to do the additional appropriation, or at least you anticipate that they will, you can enter that on line 6, which is really the 10th row here. Line 7 and 16 on those blue headers are really more so for transfers out or temporary loans. And then for the last 2 lines, we have your June 30th cash balance plus investments. And then line 2, taxes to be collected for the prior year, or sorry, for the present year, for July through December. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I will be honest that most of this does not apply to most people, but it's important to understand what these are. So let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to delve more into encumbrances. So I gave you a very quick synopsis of what that is, but let's talk a bit more about it. So encumbrance is an expense that is budgeted in 1 year, that is not spent that year, but the board or council goes through the proper procedures to carry over that expense, that appropriation, that permission to spend from one year to the next. Now, as far as how exactly that should be done, I would absolutely reach out to State Board of Accounts because ultimately they're the ones that do the audits. We want to be sure to keep them happy during our next audit. So check in with them to make sure that you do it in the proper way. But I have heard that you typically need an invoice or purchase order. With that, again, check with State Board of Accounts and they can tell you for certain. That's where this would be entered online too. Now let's work through an example here. Let's say you had saved up cash for quite a few years and you finally had enough money to buy that fire truck that you really, really wanted. And you thought it was going to be ready this year. Turns out there's some delays, as there has been lately. And you can't get it until spring of next year. But you already had it budgeted for the end of, really for this current year. You don't have it budgeted next year. This is where you can do an encumbrance. So talk to State Board of Accounts, follow the proper procedures, and then once you've done the encumbrance, send that documentation to the DLGF. So that way we can use that during the upcoming year's budget review. Now, where this can go wrong is if you leave off an encumbrance that you have done. What that would do is that would underestimate the expenditures for the last 6 months of this year, which would in turn overestimate at the end of this year, the end of this current year. So what that could do is that could result in you getting a certified budget from the DLGF that is not actually fully funded. And that can be terrifying sometimes. Imagine thinking you have enough money to get you through all your budget expenses through the year, but then towards the end of the year, you don't have enough funds to make payroll, to pay that contract that's coming up, or other very necessary expenditures. So because of how important this is one of the reasons why I'm so excited that we are giving this webinar. I don't want there to be any surprises. Next, we have line 4, other non-appropriate obligations. If I gave people a quiz, I have a feeling most people wouldn't really know what this field is because it doesn't apply a lot of times. But let's try to broaden our understanding of this. So a non-appropriate obligation is something that is to be spent that does not need to be reduced from your budget. That does not take away from your permission spend. So I know that with this one, just from over the years, it's best by talking through this with examples. So some examples are a purchase of investment. You've gone out and you bought a $10,000 certificate of deposit or a CD. So with that, on your financial report that you print off from your software or on your ledger, it may show as a $10,000 disbursement, but it's not actually an expenditure because it's still essentially cash. It's not, it's not a budget expense in State Board of Accounts eyes. There's also insurance reimbursements. Let's say you have township property or some other governmental property that gets damaged in a storm, so you need to repair your roof. Thankfully, you have insurance that covered it. They cut you a check to repair or replace that roof. So you can use this without this coming out of your budget because essentially the purpose of this is to make you whole again. Sometimes you'll get an email from the DLGF talking about transfer money to the levy access fund. Because essentially, through no fault of your own, you have over-collected property taxes for a given year. Or sometimes you transfer to the rainy day fund, or you have to do a temporary loan due to cash flow issues. These are all examples of things that might sometimes show as an expenditure, but they're not truly an appropriated expense. So the key concern here is making sure that the disbursements on this next row that you can't see here, that includes this non-appropriate expenditure, so that $10,000 CD that we bought. If that is shown there in those, you have to offset that on line 4 by entering that $10,000 amount. But let's work through 4 different scenarios to just kind of hammer this home to make sure we understand this completely. So in the first 2 scenarios, well, actually for all these, let's assume that these are insurance reimbursements. And in the first 2, let's assume that the damage and the insurance giving you the check happens all in the first 6 months. If you spend it in the first 6 months and it shows on line 6, the expenditures of the first half, you would need to add that on line 4 to offset that expenditure. Now, let's say you've got a fancy report that prints off from your software that nets out that amount. It does not include that $10,000 insurance reimbursement. In that case, you would not need to add that on line 4 because it's already subtracted out. You're only using that net amount, excluding the non-appropriateds on row 6. Now let's work on 2 other ones. Let's say you receive the insurance reimbursement in the first 6 months, but you don't spend it in the first 6 months. With here, that cash balance, that June 30th cash balance, includes that $10,000. So we do need to account for that expense happening in the future. So that's where we would absolutely show that on row 4, the other non-appropriate obligations. And for that last scenario, let's say that you don't get the insurance reimbursement until July 1st, or sometime in the last 6 months. It's not already included in that June 30th cash balance, and it's essentially a wash. You don't need to account for that anywhere in the budgeting process because you receive the extra money in the last 6 months, and you'll probably spend that in the last 6 months. But essentially, because it's not reflected in that June 30th cash balance, you're already good. You're already taken care of. Now let's take a look at the disbursements, how much you spend the first 6 months. So I have seen some units of government that have accidentally used just June's expenditures. I've seen that a bit more lately, especially with those monthly uploads that we have for State Board of Accounts. A lot of those just have the expenditures for 1 month as opposed to year to date. So you want to be absolutely certain that you're using the full January through June disbursements here. I've also seen people that have used the wrong column, so they pulled in the revenues instead of the expenses for the first half of the year. Definitely be sure that you're pulling the expenses. So lastly, one more thing I would do here is on line 9. These are your estimated remaining appropriations for the last 6 months of the year. I would compare what your remaining permission spend for the last 6 months is compared to how much you spent the first 6 months. If it's half and half, you might be okay if the expenses are pretty even. If you have spent most of your budget and you still have quite a bit more to spend, you have more to spend in obligations than you do in appropriations or permission spend, that's where you might need to seek out an additional appropriation, because you can absolutely have enough cash for the expenses that you need to make, but that does not equate to have enough permission to spend. So cash is separate from appropriation, which means permission. So always keep that in mind. Sometimes expenses definitely go up, especially lately, and you want to be sure that you still have enough spending authority or appropriations. If not, you may need to do yourself an additional appropriation, which, hey, look, that transitions perfectly. All right, so on the current year financial worksheet, there are 2 main sections for additional appropriations and reductions. There is the first section that is for ones done in the first 6 months of the current year. So line 3A, we can see additional appropriations January through June. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is not based off when you pass the ordinance or resolution for this. This is based off when you get that documentation from the DLGF saying this is approved, or we acknowledge that we receive it for those ones not certified by the DLGF. Because ultimately, it's possible that somebody may do an additional appropriation but never submit it for approval and never get that permission to spend. Or they may go through all the process that they think they might need to do, but they only advertise 9 days before the public hearing instead of 10 days, and it's ultimately not approved. So that's why it is based off the DLGF approval date. Now we also have additional appropriations for the last 6 months on line 10 and reductions for the last 6 months on line 8. So one thing to keep in mind here is with the reductions and additionals for the last 6 months, we have not been all the way through the last 6 months of this year yet. So a lot of the times these will be anticipated. With additional appropriations, this is any anticipated amount that you think that you might have. If for some reason you have 0, but when we work the budget, it's more, we'll use the actuals. On the other hand, with the reductions, we will assume that it is 0, even if you have entered an amount of, let's say, 100,000 here or 10,000. The only way we can show a reduction here is if we have signed paperwork, so a signed resolution approving that reduction. And the reason why the DLGF does that is we work the budget before the end of the year, so be conservative with your cash reserves at the end of this year. We have to assume that you'll spend your entire budget. Now, we're definitely not saying that's a good idea, but if we assumed anything less and you had permission to spend more, we could overstate your ending cash reserves. So that's where that can be pretty bad. Because if we overstate your ending cash reserves, we could have a budget that's not fully funded. Now, the deadline to get us a reduction resolution, if you adopt it with your Form 4, your normal adoption, that works out perfectly fine. There's really no risk there of us not having it in time, but we need it before that 1782 notice expires. Now, that may be early November, but that's not really a hard and fast date. But if you have it to us by early November, that'll probably work. But if you just want to get it done early and have it be safe and easy, you can adopt that at the adoption meeting as well. But the final deadline is by the expiration of the 1782 notice window, that 10-day window. Now, at the bottom of this form, we have the June 30th cash balance. Now, I've seen people use the January 1st cash balance. I've seen people use the cash balance without any CDs or investments included, and those rare cases where they do have those. But I typically see a little bit more go right with the very last one. And we'll admit, this one's not the most intuitive. It says taxes to be collected present year, December settlement. To be more specific, these are property taxes, not just all taxes, but only property taxes to be collected. And technically this is from July 1st through December 31st. Now, if you receive your property taxes in the spring and deposit by June 30th, yeah, these are absolutely just the December property taxes. If you're one of the incredibly few units that did not get those in by June 30th for whatever reason, this would be the full year. Now, what we don't want to do is overestimate this revenue of property taxes for the last 6 months of this year. So for every single fund except debt service funds, we want to be sure to account for circuit breaker losses, also known as property tax cap losses. But this year we have a very useful form that can help you out quite a bit. Now let's talk about how to find that. You would you would go to our DLGF website, in.gov/DLGF. On the left-hand side, there's a navigation pane, and you'll choose the option that says county-specific information. But don't fall into the trap of clicking on your county. Scroll down to the statewide reports. They're posted there much sooner before our poor communications director has to break down all these reports 92 different times. It's quite the feat. But scroll down to where it says statewide reports, and this is where you'll be able to find those as soon as possible. So there will be one that talks about estimated December property taxes. And from there, you will select your county, select your unit, and it'll map in all the values and calculate what the DLGF amount is that we'll use for this report, for this estimate. Next, let's take a look at Form 1, your budget for next year. So with the budget Form 1, this takes your line item budget and breaks it down by funds and then departments. On top of that, it breaks it down even further by these different blue tabs or expenditure categories. So you can see in this case, we have personal services, supplies, services and charges, capital outlays, and debt service. If you're a township and you have a township assistance fund, you'd also see one for township assistance. But I've absolutely seen quite a few mistakes here. So I've seen people enter dozens and dozens of advertised amounts for a single section, then click on the next section, and unfortunately lose all the data they've entered. So absolutely be sure to click save before moving on to the next category. So unfortunately, if you don't do that, you'll probably lose it. So save early, save often. That's the department's motto. Now down here, we have the add button. So if you click on salaries and wages, you'll have a drop-down list of all the different subcategories that apply. These are unique to each blue tab, each expenditure category. The line item code is completely optional, but you wouldn't really know that, which kind of takes us to another mistake that people make. Is there's a little blue information icon. Looks like a little blue shield with an eye on it. If you hover over that, that'll tell you a lot more about that field. And these are present throughout pretty much all of Gateways, at least all the budget application. And people don't use those as often as they should. So anytime you see one, be curious, try to learn, hover over it, and it'll tell you a lot more about that. Then we have the description. The description is always required. Enter an advertised amount, then click add. Anytime you're adding a new line item, you need to click add. If you're trying to save amounts, don't click it, or else you'll lose what you've already done. Now, one more thing I do want to mention is that copy arrow. That have been the demise of a few units of government. Because if you click it, it'll only copy over what you see here on the page, which can be a little bit deceptive. That's why you always want to check the totals at the bottom. If you see totals for 100,000 on the left for the advertised amount, but only 1,000 on the right, you might have a problem. These two should always match unless you are intentionally reducing the budget between what you advertise and what you adopt. Now, if you want to copy over everything at one time, on the top right, there's a big blue button on the top right. Being lured out there, but it's that important. Big blue box or button on the top right that says copy all advertised amounts to adopted for all funds. Something along those lines. That move everything over, then double check that totals by unit, that grand total at the very bottom. And then also, just as another caveat there, is there's no opportunity to increase the overall budget for a fund between what's advertised to adopted without restarting the process. So once you submit your advertisement, that locks in the grand total for each fund that you can budget for next year. So this is one of those controlling documents. Form 3 is your notice to taxpayers. Now, with this, a few other mistakes that we see sometimes, and this one's pretty rare, but every now and then there's that odd year where there is 27 pay periods. So it doesn't normally happen, but when it does, that can throw people for a loop for sure. So that's something that you'll want to do the math and check to see, does this year have 27 pays? Assuming you have salary employees that are paid, or really employees are paid biannually. So some townships may not really apply there, but there are definitely other units of government where this would absolutely be something that we want to account for. Now, if you're one of those large units that use a flat file upload to upload Form 1's data, always double, triple, quadruple, quintuple check these amounts just to be safe. At a bare minimum, do the grand totals match. I've seen cases where whole funds have been not uploaded, and it's great that we have that option. You always want to verify that it worked correctly. Also, just overall with your budget, make sure that it's adequate. Are you adding any new staff that needs to be budgeted? Any new expenses? Are you making a one-time purchase? And I'd also recommend comparing this against last year's. Did you have any additional appropriation last year that caused for increased spending that would need to be budgeted again for this upcoming year? Because you can avoid doing additional appropriation next year. You budget it proactively for now. And lastly here, I will say, please be descriptive with your descriptions. So, sounds a little odd, but no matter how long we work for the unit of government that we work with, somebody else will eventually hold the same roles that we currently do. And you can help them quite a bit with the transition process. So if you have rainy day under the capital outlays category, you have a line item called miscellaneous, or let's say $50,000. And then the next year, you're not there for whatever reason. You might find that somebody comes there next year, they see rainy day, capital outlays, miscellaneous, $50,000, and think, oh, great, I'm going to remodel the office. Because they have no idea that's for a down payment on a new fire truck or whatever you had intended that for. So while you can absolutely use miscellaneous or these kind of more vague descriptions, it can absolutely help tremendously with anybody else coming in to the role. Or if you're like me and don't and have less than perfect memory, it can help to smooth things out a bit more as well. So with Form 2, these are for estimates for all non-property tax revenues. Well, I say all, but there's most. And I will talk about some of those exceptions later. But from here, it divides them all into a few different categories. For civil units, excluding schools, it's taxes and intergovernmental, licenses and permits, charges for services, fines, forfeitures, and fees, and then other receipts. Now, the budgeting process spans 18 months, the last 6 months of this year, then all of next year. So that's why we have column A and column B, last 6 months and the next year. So like Form 1, save early, save often. Once you enter the amount on a page or a category, definitely be sure to click save before you move on to the next tab. Now, one thing I do also want to note is it's best to be conservative with your revenues. You don't want to overestimate these. But lastly, for this page, I do also want to point out that this is not the annual financial report. You don't have to account for every single anticipated cent that you may receive. So that gumball machine you have out front, that nets you a cool $10 a year, that does not need to be included. However, you probably want to use any larger revenues because each one goes towards funding your proposed budget. So let's talk about some more caveats for the form too, some things that we need to consider. So first off, are you still receiving these revenues? Do you have the other revenue for $2,000 that you put there every single year, but you don't really know what it is? I will advise you to make sure that you know what every revenue is. If you don't know what it is and you can't match it back to any receipts that you actually have, you may not be receiving that anymore. And that may not be being conservative with the revenue estimates. And if we're not conservative with the revenue estimates, if you bank on money that you do not have, you'll probably get a budget that's fully funded by the department during certification, but in reality, you may not have enough funds to actually meet it. So again, this is where I kind of go to that tragic story of the year's not over. So you've got too much year at the end of the money, essentially. And that can be very, very challenging. So also, are they still coming in as you've been estimating? Maybe use the same estimates every single year for county wheel tax or some other revenue. Check against the actuals. Are you still getting it by roughly these amounts? Have they increased a lot? Have they decreased? You want to be sure to account for those. Then also, should any other revenues be listed? So do you have some new revenues that you've not been accounting for in the past? Let's talk about some restrictions though. Sometimes some municipal government are, let's say lucky, and they receive supplemental lit distributions. Those are typically received in the spring, but those are things that we should never really be counting on. So if you add those to the Form 2, the DLGF will need to remove those during the budget certification process. We can't account for those. One other revenue that we can't account for would be rainy day transfers. So transfers into the rainy day fund without a signed resolution. So if you have one for the last 6 months of this year, that's great, as long as you have a signed resolution for that, approving it. If you have one for next year though, unfortunately, that's where I don't think we can include it. Now, if you are showing a transfer in from another fund that's budgeted, be sure to show that on the current year financial worksheet under that line 7 section. So we can account for that money leaving the other fund. Now, if you're a school and you have some education operations transfers, those would actually be entered on the Form 4B on that data entry pop-up page where it says school transfers out. So with that, let's transition to Form 3, our notice to taxpayers. So Form 3 is submitted to formally advertise the budget. You used to have to advertise in the newspaper. Now that's optional. It's been optional for quite a while now. But it's really split into 2 main sections. The first one really contains information about where the office location is, if they have any questions about the budget. It also talks about who's going to adopt the budget. And then at the bottom part of the screenshot, it talks about the date, time, and location of the public hearing, and the same for the adoption meeting on the right. Now beneath this, we can't see in this screenshot, but there's another blue button that says Edit Special Notes. So this is one other mistake that I typically see on here is for townships, they are legally required to advertise their township assistance phone number. So you can edit special notes, type the township assistance phone number for this township is, and then type out the phone number and then click update. And that'll comply with that part of statute because there really isn't any other place to include that number on the Form 3, your notice to taxpayers. Now, additionally, for the times, definitely make sure that you get the right time. You may have your meeting at 2 p.m. and that's what you meant to advertise. But if you actually advertise 2 a.m., that's when you're legally obligated to have your meeting unless you essentially correct that. If you ever need to make any corrections to what's already been submitted on the Form 3, you will absolutely need to reach out to your budget field rep. That way we can help you get that corrected in a timely manner. Now, with meeting dates, unless you're Marion County, Indianapolis, so a first-class city or a second-class city, such as Bloomington, Muncie, those large cities with city controllers, the public hearing and the adoption meeting need to be at least 10 calendar days apart. So absolutely review the calendars and make sure everyone is available for the public hearing, or at least a quorum, which is typically the majority of the board or council. So I've seen people set a meeting for Labor Day, which you're definitely allowed to do. So we won't find any issues with that. But you need to be sure that you can still get a majority of the board or council there. Also, Columbus Day is something that we see, or a weekend or fall break, or with townships, sometimes If you have farmers on the board, they may be busy at that time of the year. So absolutely talk to your board, talk to your council, and make sure that you coordinate those meeting dates with when they will be there. Look at the vacations planned by the board. So also try not to schedule meetings too close to the very last deadline of adopting by November 1st. This can be a big mistake because sometimes life happens. It happens a lot. So if you adopt very close to the November 1st deadline, but there is, or at least you plan to, and there's some hiccup there, somebody's on vacation, somebody's sick, maybe someone wins the lottery and just skips out. Let's try to go with some positive things there. What could happen there is you may not have enough time to restart the budgeting process, and that can definitely cause some issues. Now, again, anytime you need to change these dates or times or amounts on the Form 3 that's already submitted, be absolutely certain to reach out to your DLGF budget field rep. So that way the legal Form 3 advertisement, that is the notice to taxpayers, can be corrected in an appropriate manner. I had one case where there's a pretty large unit that noticed that they did try to hold adoption meeting on Columbus Day, and they decided to just correct it in their newspaper advertisement. That's not required, which is great, but that unfortunately is not good enough. When I'm reviewing the budget, it has to be the legal advertisement that's Form 3. That is where it has to be correct, and other places as well. And again, reach out to your budget field rep if you have any plan changes that need to be made. Now at the bottom section of Form 3, this contains the proposed budgets, levies, and excess levy appeals. So it's already populated with the current year levies. So you can do a comparison here. Now I would definitely check this. Going on to the next one, we have the estimated civil max levy, estimated fire max levy if that applies, and the circuit breaker estimates. So what I would absolutely do is I would check the budgets on this section and compare that to your Form 1. So ideally, those should absolutely match. Less ideally, there's an issue that needs to be corrected. I'd also take a look at the levies as well. If you're trying to be at your max levy, trying to get everything you can, your levy should probably be at least the estimated max levy that appears on that Form 3. Now, I'm going to assign homework where everybody should go to their Form 3 and add up their property taxes for the funds that fall into each category of either civil or fire. Schools are just one fund, so that's a little bit easier. And make sure to compare yourself to that maximum. Now, the property tax caps, that's something that we'll talk about as well. But with the property taxes, make sure that those are where you want them to be. Debt service funds are outside of this, so keep that in mind as well. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see being made is where we have let's say a new official that comes in and they have a certified budget that's fairly high. They say, oh, this is great. We're going to do this and do this and do this and do this. But they do that without any regard to comparing their expenditures to their revenues. If you want to spend more than your revenues, you absolutely can in the short term. If you make a habit of that and do that every single year, eventually that cash reserve will be spent down to zero. And that can be a problem because if the cash reserves go down to zero, you really don't have any more flexibility. The most you can budget are the upcoming revenues. So being with the DLGF, I just make sure that your ending cash balance for that budget year is at least $0. It's the units of governments and the boards and the council's responsibility to make sure that they're intentionally managing their cash flow. That's not anything that the DLGF does. That's all local control. So definitely be sure to keep that in mind. Now with Form 4, it's divided into 3 main sections. The first one talks about the adopting body and the adoption date. And in almost every single case, the adoption date on Form 4 should match the adoption date on Form 3. Now, just in case it does not, the only reason why that should be is if you hold your adoption meeting on the advertised date, and for whatever reason, they need more time. So from there, you would continue the meeting. Don't close, don't adjourn at the meeting, and then clearly state in the meeting minutes as well that you are continuing the meeting to a specific date, time, and location. Then from there, the Form 4 would be some later date, because you did originally hold the adoption meeting on that Form 3 date, notice of adoption. So keep that in mind there. Now, the second section will list the budgets, levies, and rates. And this is one that always gives me a little bit of anxiety here. If I saw Form 4 like this, I'd be petrified, because there are no property tax levies and no property tax rate. For a unit of government that would typically have these revenues, levies and rates, and also there's no budgets besides the casino riverboat fund. So always compare this to the Form 3. Make sure that these match. And the only reason why they should not match is if the board or council is intentionally trying to reduce either their permission spend or their property tax revenue. So if you're intentionally trying to do it, that's great. If you did this accidentally, give us a call. We want to help you out. Then underneath this section, there is one for home rule funds. Those 9,500s that the DLGF never reviews. Those don't get pulled in automatically like these do. The ones on top come from Form 4B's adopted column. So if you need to correct something, you need to do it there. With the second section that's for home rule funds, be sure to click that button at the bottom that says copy home rule budgets from Form 1's adopted column, and that'll pull those in. So at the bottom section of Form 4, there is a place for you to type in your board or council members, and make sure that they all sign and mark how they vote. So one but not the other, not good enough, unfortunately. We need both the signature and then to mark how they vote for a valid vote, essentially. Now, underneath this, cities, towns, and counties are required to have somebody to attest, and cities are required to have someone sign, the mayor, sign and either veto or approve the budget, hopefully the latter. Now, the 17.2 notice, what happens after you submit all the budget forms, this is where the DLGF comes into play, and we review the budget. We send out something called a 1782 notice that summarizes the budget forms, any changes that were made during our review, and it's automatically emailed out to anybody, any email address on this list. So definitely be sure to review the names and emails. Should anybody be added? Is there some person that nowhere works that should be removed? Are there any typos in the email addresses? Because unfortunately, our program isn't smart enough to know the difference between .com and .con. So definitely review these carefully. And also, are there any board members present that are no longer working there, or any that you want to include? I think it's great to get the entire board or council involved in the budgeting process. So I think we all need to be informed while working with these financial figures. Next, let's talk about the budget form submission. So the Form 3 has to be submitted at least 10 calendar days before the public hearing. All other forms need to be submitted at least all other forms need to be submitted no later than 5 business days after the adoption meeting. So if any of these aren't met, like especially that first one, that Form 3, that's where you're jeopardizing the approval of the budgeting of the units of government's budget. So especially the notice to taxpayers, that Form 3, reach out to us if you don't have at least 10 calendar days submitted prior, so we can help you get that corrected. Now let's talk about some special circumstances. There's this code citation that essentially states that if you have for a city, town, or township, that if you are a volunteer firefighter in a volunteer fire department or in a fire department, you may not vote in the adoption of the budgets or tax levies. So with that, you can delve more into the code citation, but there's another exception as well. If you are a township, a family member of the trustee may not vote on the board on the budgets or levies for the township. So definitely keep that in mind as well. So in these cases, if you don't have the majority of your board there voting for the budget, that's a big issue, because you ultimately cannot approve the budget. Now, let's say you've got a 3-member board, you've got 1 family member, and you've got 1 volunteer firefighter, and neither can vote on the budget. There is no way that you can adopt your own. So thankfully, there is a way to get through this. You can petition to the county council. So you would still advertise the Form 3 as with your public hearing, so you hold that. Then you have to petition to the county council to have them approve or deny your budgets and property taxes that you propose. If they deny it, you're reverted back to last year's property taxes and last year's budgets. If they approve it, no. It's just like the normal budgeting process. Now, the approval by the county council would need to be submitted through Gateway, but do yourself a favor. If you fall into any of these categories, reach out to your budget builder up so that way we can help you out. Now with binding units, such as solid waste districts, airports, fire districts, and several others, there is a September 1st deadline where once that date passes, your editing access will be switched to read only. You can't change anything in the budget application at all as of September 1st onwards. So it's very important that you enter all this information that you need to in Gateway on those budget forms before that deadline. Now, another thing that is very important that I've seen go awry a few times, and it's terrible every time it does, is let's say it's the county's responsibility to adopt the budget. It's technically their responsibility to advertise the budget, so submit the Form 3, to adopt the budget, and also submit the budget forms. So if they don't do that for one of those binding review units, but they provided all the information to the county by that date and time, by September 1st, then that is where both the county and the binding unit would be continued. Now, sometimes cities are the adopting bodies, sometimes it's the county, but whoever would do the adoption for the binding unit would also be continued if these processes are not carried out for those binding units. So definitely keep that in mind because this is a very serious thing that we need to account for. Now, libraries, they have a maximum budget that they can adopt and advertise, more so advertise. And if they exceed that, they do not have the ability to essentially adopt their own budget. So that's something that we really need to account for very carefully. So in order to calculate this, definitely go to the DLGF website, go to the county specific information. And from there, there's two ways. You can take a look at the budget order for 2023, go down to your library, have you click on the budget order for your county for 2023, find your total budget, multiply that by the growth quotient. So for page 2024, that's 1.04. Then round down and subtract $1. That's the absolute maximum that you can advertise and adopt, excluding gift funds and other home rule funds that the DLGF does not review, and still be able to adopt your own budget. So if you need to be over this, reach out to your DLGF budget field rep, and we can help coordinate that binding review or answer any questions that you might have. So there's also a July report on this. So if you go to the DLGF homepage, in.gov/DLGF, click on county specific, and then scroll past the list of counties to the statewide reports, you'll see one for the maximum library non-binding review budget report. That can help you out quite a bit with this as well. Let's talk about what to do when the unexpected happens. Hopefully, with all this prevention, all this education we've done, we avoid all these. But let's plan to know what to do just in case that these happens. So if there is no quorum at the public hearing, there's really not much you can do besides restart the entire process of advertising the Form 3 with the new dates. And then, and in order to do that, because the Form 3 would have already been submitted, you have to reach out to your DLGF budget field rep. You cannot change this yourself. So you'll need to come up with the new public hearings and adoption meeting dates, times, and locations. Locations may stay the same, times may stay the same, but the dates would probably definitely need to change. Now, if you have no quorum at the adoption meeting, this will still require you to hold a new adoption meeting with a new meeting date. In order to do this, again, you need to contact the DLGF budget field, your DLGF budget field rep. Now, with this, thankfully, you would not necessarily need to restart the entire process over again. You could let us know with a little bit of lead time, at least in this case, probably call it about a week or so before you hold that new meeting, assuming it's no later than November 1st. So we can get that Form 3 updated for you with that new date and or time and location that you need to hold it. So let's just say at the adoption meeting, the board needs a little bit more time to discuss the budget. Absolutely do not close the meeting, do not adjourn, very specifically continue, in air quotes, continue the meeting to a specific date, time, and location. The department will ask for the meeting minutes to confirm this. And lastly, this one's rare, but it seems like it's happening a little bit more lately. Within 7 days after a public hearing, 10 or more taxpayers can file an objection to the budget. Now, if this happens, the board would need to consider the objection, and they would have to adopt findings on this objection. You don't necessarily have to do what the objection says, but you have to absolutely address those findings along with any changes on the budget based on these objections if you choose to make any changes. So if that happens, you would absolutely have to upload the objections and the findings along with your sign form 4. Now with that, do we have any questions?
Yes, Ryan, we had a couple get submitted. The first one is, can we transfer more from education to operation than we account for on our Form 4B, or are we held to that amount for the year?
Thankfully, that's not a binding amount. You can definitely change that. It's ultimately up to the signed resolutions that permit you to transfer up to a certain amount. So although that is the amount that went towards funding your budget on paper, those can still change. But let's say you increase the transfer by $10,000 from ed to ops. The education fund would have $10,000 less, and operations would have $10,000 more. So you have to make sure that you have enough cushion there in education to absorb that loss of income or cash. And the operations has that extra, which is a lot easier to deal with. So, yep, you're not locked in with those original estimates. Good question.
Great. We have another question. So a quorum for the board has to be at both the public hearing and the adoption hearing. We thought they only had to be at the adoption meeting.
So I would absolutely recommend reaching out to the public access counselor, but with everything I've learned over the past 12 years, I think for the public hearing and the adoption meeting, you need a quorum to open the hearing. Otherwise, you can't, or to open any meeting. There might be some exceptions I'm not aware of, but when it comes to the public hearing, the adoption for the budget, I'm not aware of any. So with that, you need at least a majority of the board present or council.
Great, thank you. Looks like that includes all of the questions that we've had submitted so far. If there's anybody that has any more questions, we have a few minutes left before we will conclude the webinar today. Ryan, did you have any questions that you wanted to go over from this morning that would be helpful to this group as well?
So I was thinking through those, and I think we were able to cover most of those during the presentation themselves. So yeah, I can't think of any at this time. Jen, you have the list, and you might have that list handy. Can you think of any that we might not have covered?
I think that the one of the most important pieces that, and I can share my screen as well,
Sure.
just to show for those individuals that may not be familiar with where the reports are located. We also did the other day upload the local income tax report. So that is now available on the county page. So I'm going to pull up my website here, and we'll take a look at where you can find this information so that it is available to you. Hang on just one second and let me get here. So if you can see here on the website, so this is the main DLGF website. If you haven't been on it before, the website is in.gov/DLGF as in Frank. And over here are two areas that I wanted to point out to you. First is the contact us. As Ryan mentioned, the information about your budget field representative, that information can be found on this page, as well as the other staff members here at the DLGF in case you do need to reach out to us. So that information is always current. And if you have any problems with it, please let me know. Then down here, a couple links down is going to be county specific information. If you click on that, that's going to take you to a list of all of the counties, and this is going to be the individual county reports. We did format the reports slightly differently this year for some of the ones that you typically have seen in July previously. So if you scroll down below this list of counties, these are also on the county specific pages. So I'm just going to show you here where they are statewide reports. They will be here. And so you will see all of the 2024 reports here, including this first link is the one that we just posted this week of the estimated local income tax report. I know we had several people that were interested in that information. So that is available there, as well as we had a few people that were asking about the miscellaneous revenues report, and that is down here at the bottom. If you scroll down, you will see prior years. So we do have typically 5 years back. If you need something different, you can reach out to your field representative, but that information is available on this page below the counties, as well as on the county pages. So you should be able to find that. If you have any problems with the website, please reach out to me and we'll get that over for you. Ryan, we did have another question come in, and that is, what is the September 1 deadline? If I have not entered all revenue expenses by then, I cannot make any changes. Is that correct?
So one thing to keep in mind there is that's only for binding units. So if you are a solid waste district, an airport, maybe a fire district, then yes. As of September 2nd, your editing access gets switched over to read only. But if you're a township, city, county, school, or most schools typically, you'd have access past that September 1st deadline. But yes, if somebody else does adopt the budget for you, then that September deadline is very real. And from there, if it's September 2nd and you realize a change that you need to make, you need to reach out to the fiscal officer. So maybe the county auditor or maybe city controller, whoever's adopting the budget, and maybe request them to make those changes. So that's probably the best idea that I would have for cases where you are indeed a binding unit, but you do need to make a change after September 1st for whatever reason. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here since it is 3 o'clock. Just a reminder, the information from today's webinar, the PowerPoint, the video, the survey link, as well as the CE form or the continuing education form will be emailed out to those that were registered in advance. And also they will be available on the DLGF website on the webinars page. So you can view those at any point and or share those with other individuals that you think would be find this information helpful. And again, please complete the survey. We do take that feedback very seriously as we start to plan for 2024. We will look at all of the feedback and make selections on different topics that might be of interest to our participants. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you at a future webinar. We have one each month for the next couple of months through the end of the year. So hopefully we will see you again at a future webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today.